Hello, and welcome to this exploration of one of the most significant documents in English history, Magna Carta. I'm going to take you on a journey through the tumultuous events that led to its creation and examine its lasting impact on law and governance. Now, you might be wondering why a charter from 1215 is still relevant today. Well, I'd argue that Magna Carta laid the foundations for many of the rights and freedoms we take for granted in modern democracies. It's a fascinating story of power struggles, rebellion, and the birth of constitutional principles. Let's start by setting the scene. It's the early 13th century and England is ruled by King John, a monarch who's not exactly winning any popularity contests. John had lost most of his family's lands in France, and he was constantly at odds with his barons. To make matters worse, he was desperately short of money, and kept raising taxes to fund his military campaigns. The barons were fed up, and they were about to reach their breaking point. It's important to understand that medieval England wasn't the absolute monarchy we might imagine. The king's power was already limited by custom and feudal obligations, but John had a habit of pushing those limits, and the barons were determined to push back. The situation came to a head in 1215. The barons, led by men like Robert Fitzwalter, decided they'd had enough. They raised an army and marched on London, effectively starting a civil war. Now, this wasn't just about money or land, though those were certainly important factors. The barons were demanding a fundamental change in how England was governed. They wanted written guarantees of their rights and limitations on the king's power. It's a bit like if today's politicians suddenly decided to rewrite the entire constitution, a massive undertaking with far-reaching consequences. King John, realising he was in a tight spot, agreed to negotiate. The two sides met at Runnymede, a meadow by the River Thames. It's fascinating to think about the drama of that moment. The king and his advisors facing off against the rebel barons, with the future of the kingdom hanging in the balance. The result of these tense negotiations was Magna Carta. Now, it's important to note that this wasn't some enlightened document granting rights to all. It was very much a product of its time, primarily concerned with the rights of the barons and the church. But it did include some broader principles that would prove incredibly influential in the centuries to come. The Charter concluded this section with the phrase, "Debts owing to other than Jews shall be dealt with likewise," so it is debatable to what extent the Jews were being singled out by these clauses. One of the most famous clauses of Magna Carta states that no free man shall be imprisoned or stripped of his rights, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. This principle of due process is still a cornerstone of legal systems around the world today. It's remarkable to think that this idea, which we now take for granted, was first written down in a field in England over 800 years ago. Of course, at the time, it only applied to free men, a small portion of the population, but the principle itself would prove to have lasting power. You might think that with Magna Carta signed, sealed and delivered, everything would be sorted. But history is rarely that neat and tidy. Almost as soon as the ink was dry, both sides started to have second thoughts. King John appealed to the Pope, who declared the charter null and void. The barons, for their part, weren't satisfied with just a piece of parchment. They wanted to make sure John would actually stick to it. The result? Civil war broke out again. This conflict might have dragged on for years, but fate had other plans. In October 1216, King John died, rather ignominiously it's said, of dysentery while on campaign. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, inherited the throne. Now you might think a child king would be a disaster, but it actually provided an opportunity for compromise. The regents ruling on Henry's behalf reissued Magna Carta in 1216, and again in 1217, making some changes each time. These reissues helped to establish Magna Carta as a permanent part of English law, rather than just a temporary peace treaty. Neither Magna Carta nor the subsequent Charter of the Forest proved entirely satisfactory as a way of managing the political tensions arising in the operation of the royal forests. It's fascinating to see how Magna Carta evolved over these early years. The 1217 version, for example, was accompanied by a new Charter of the Forest, which dealt with the contentious issue of royal forest laws. These were incredibly unpopular restrictions on how people could use woodland areas, and reforming them had been a key demand of the barons. The fact that they got their own charter shows just how important this issue was at the time. It's a reminder that, while we tend to focus on the grand principles in Magna Carta, many of its clauses dealt with very specific practical grievances. As we move into the later medieval period and beyond, Magna Carta took on a life of its own. It was reissued multiple times by various monarchs, often in exchange for new taxes. Each time it was reaffirmed, it became more deeply embedded in English political life. But what's really interesting is how its interpretation changed over time. In the 17th century, for example, legal scholars like Sir Edward Coke used Magna Carta to challenge the idea of absolute monarchy. They argued that it proved England had always been governed by law, not by royal whim. Now, this was a pretty creative interpretation of medieval history, but it proved incredibly influential. This idea of Magna Carta as a fundamental law protecting ancient English liberties became a powerful political myth. It influenced the American colonists in their struggle against British rule, and you can see echoes of Magna Carta in the US Constitution and Bill of Rights. The Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process, for example, can be traced back to that clause I mentioned earlier about free men not being imprisoned without lawful judgment. It's a remarkable example of how medieval ideas can be reinterpreted and repurposed in completely different contexts. Each of these proclaim that no person may be imprisoned or detained without evidence that he or she committed a crime. The Ninth Amendment states that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. The writers of the US Constitution wished to ensure that the rights they already held, such as those that they believed were provided by Magna Carta, would be preserved unless explicitly curtailed. Of course, modern historians have a much more nuanced view of Magna Carta. We now understand that it wasn't some early declaration of universal human rights, but a feudal document primarily concerned with the interests of the barons. Many of its clauses dealt with very specific issues that are no longer relevant today. But I'd argue that this doesn't diminish its importance. The fact that Magna Carta has been continually reinterpreted and reinvented over the centuries is part of what makes it so fascinating. It's not just a historical artifact, but a living symbol of the ongoing struggle to balance power and rights in a society. Today, only 3 clauses of Magna Carta remain on the statute books in England and Wales. These deal with the freedom of the English Church, the ancient liberties of the City of London, and the right to due legal process. But its symbolic power remains immense. In 2015, the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta was marked with great fanfare, including a ceremony attended by the Queen and a special exhibition at the British Library. It's remarkable to think that a document from 1215 can still generate such interest and reverence. But it's not just in Britain that Magna Carta continues to resonate. Its principles have influenced constitutions and legal systems around the world. In the United States, for example, there's a replica of Magna Carta on display in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. It's seen as an important precursor to the Constitution and Bill of Rights. Even in countries without a direct link to English legal tradition, the idea of a document limiting government power and protecting individual rights has been hugely influential. The document also continues to be honoured in the United States as an antecedent of the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights. Of course, we shouldn't overstate Magna Carta's influence or ignore its limitations. Many of the rights we associate with it today, like freedom of speech or universal suffrage, were completely alien to 13th century England. And the idea that it established some kind of proto-democracy is frankly anachronistic. But I think what's truly remarkable about Magna Carta is how it's been continually reinterpreted and reinvented over the centuries. It's a powerful reminder that our political and legal institutions aren't fixed and unchanging, but the result of centuries of struggle and negotiation. And in a world where democratic norms sometimes seem under threat, perhaps that's a lesson worth remembering. As we come to the end of our exploration of Magna Carta, I'm struck by how this single document encapsulates so much of the complexity and contradiction of history. It began as a peace treaty between a king and his barons, became a cornerstone of English law, and eventually a global symbol of liberty and rights. Yet at the same time, It's a reminder of how slowly and unevenly progress often happens. The rights it established were initially for a tiny elite, and it took centuries of struggle to extend them more broadly. What I find most fascinating about Magna Carta is how it's been continually reinterpreted and reinvented over the centuries. Each generation has found something new in it, something that speaks to their own struggles and aspirations. And while we might smile at some of the more fanciful interpretations, like the idea that it established some kind of medieval democracy, I think this process of reinterpretation is actually part of what makes Magna Carta so important. It's not just a historical document, but a living symbol of the ongoing struggle to balance power and rights in a society. The historian W.L. Warren has observed that many who knew little and cared less about the content of the Charter have in nearly all ages invoked its name, and with good cause, for it meant more than it said. As we face new challenges in the 21st century, from the impact of technology on privacy to the balance between security and civil liberties, perhaps we can still find inspiration in Magna Carta, not as a blueprint for modern governance, but as a reminder that the relationship between the government and the governed is always evolving, always being negotiated and renegotiated, and that's a process we all have a stake in. Thanks for joining me on this journey through history. If you've enjoyed this exploration of Magna Carta, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Your support really does make a difference. And do let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like to see covered in future videos. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep learning from history.